All right, welcome to CHI's Unlearning Our Loneliness. We are in week 4, Paradoxes of Love and Identity, looking at Milan Kundera's short story, The Hitchhiking Game. A little preview or review from last week, we discussed Mary Gaitskell's The Dentist in terms of its movement from obsession to desire to vulnerability and a failed intimacy. And we postulated that the failure of intimacy emerges toward our inmost ambivalence concerning its possibility. Inasmuch as we simultaneously desire and fear to abandon our loneliness, we confront ourselves with situations that offer an object that we can cathect our emotional and sexual energy onto without having a strong hope or desire that the object can find us fulfilling. Unlearning our loneliness thus requires that we understand our ambivalence and learn to allow a growth from a space of vulnerability and openness to another's pains and fears. So that was last week in a nutshell. This week, like I said, we're discussing the hitchhiking game, and we're approaching it in terms of its capacity to expose to us the core of our own identity. Love can expose the truth of our identities relative to one another, and it becomes terrifying when this occurs. Kundera's focus on the story shifts between the young man and the girl and observes how they co-create and perpetuate a story that each realizes is filled with dangers both for them and for the relationship. The story exposes the fragility of relationships for individual identities and thus exposes why it's so difficult for us to unlearn our loneliness. So that's this week. And I'm just going to take it, it's divided into 10 chapters, so I'll just go chapter by chapter, read some text, and talk about how it frames things. So here we go, paragraph 1. In paragraph 1, Kundera talks about finding desirable that which one had liked least. And this gets into the kind of the heart of paradox. The logic of a paradox is something that, according to Kierkegaard, refuses the understanding. A paradox is something that cannot be understood because once you understand it, it's no longer a paradox. Does that make sense? The only way to confront a paradox is just to accept the fact that it's paradoxical and just hold it as a paradox without trying to get to one side or the other of it in a way that would make it make sense in a rational way. Does that make sense in a rational way? Okay, all right. So as I go through, I'm also going to be talking about different paradoxes between love and identity that Kundera starts to unfold or unpack for the reader as the story goes along. So, paragraph 1, finding desirable that which one had liked least. He writes, quote, "Jealousy isn't a pleasant quality, but if it isn't overdone, and if it's combined with modesty, apart from its inconvenience, there's even something touching about it. At least that's what the young man thought. In the girl sitting beside him, he valued precisely what, until now, he had met with least in women, purity." So one way to understand this is that love forefronts as desirable in another the qualities that one hadn't before found desirable. That's what love does. It's able to bring those hidden qualities that one didn't even know one liked to the foreground, and that's part of what makes the beloved unique to us. In this case, the young man's change also seems to reflect an increase in maturity, right? Like, oh, maybe purity is something good. Maybe there's something beneficial to that. I will appreciate that about this person, but there's also something specific about that person who allows that to come to the foreground as a desirable property. Does that make sense? Okay. Paragraph 2, difference in temporality. Quote, "He had known her for a year now, but she would still get shy in front of him. He enjoyed her moments of shyness, partly because they distinguished her from the women he had met before, partly because he was aware of the law of universal transience, which made even his girl's shyness a precious thing to him." End quote. Shyness here seems related to purity. It's something that sets this woman apart and allows the young man to recognize this as a different kind of relationship through accepting that she's a different kind of woman, right? Her capacity for shyness betrays her inner purity, and that's something that he now likes to have revealed rather than something that he would prefer to have hidden. Okay? Part 2, paragraph 3. Now we're focusing on the girl, and this is where Kundera talks about the body as something that's both impersonal and personal. Quote, "She always got shy in advance at the thought of how she was going to get shy. She often longed to feel free and easy about her body, had even invented a special course in self-persuasion. She would repeat to herself that at birth, every human being received one out of the millions of available bodies, as one would receive an allotted room out of the millions of rooms in an enormous hotel. Consequently, the body was fortuitous and impersonal. It was a ready-made, borrowed thing. End quote. The body, in other words, is neither her nor hers. It is in actuality, and that's why she gets shy. That's why she treasures her purity, because it's so close to her. But the way she tries to think about it is as something that she occupies, something that she just happens to be in, not something that belongs to her uniquely. Continuing. She would repeat this to herself in different ways, but she could never manage to feel it, right? She could know it intellectually, but she could never manage to feel it. Returning, this mind-body dualism was alien to her. She was too much one with her body. That's why she always felt such anxiety about it. So the problem is that there's too much identification with her flesh. She can think of her body impersonally, but in her experience, she remains too much one with her body. Thinking of her body as alien or other is an alien way of thinking to her. She cares for and about her body. She's always her body, and she can't successfully divorce or detach herself from that. And that's where the girl starts. So from the outside, it's perceived as a desire for purity. Internal to her own system of consciousness, it's not really a desire for purity. It's just this. It's the horrifying sense that she can't not be what her flesh is. Make sense? It has to be protected. It's too vulnerable. Her body's way too vulnerable. She has to protect it somehow. But she resists that compulsion to protect it, and that's what she's internally trying to work against. That's the paradox that she's facing. Does that make sense? Okay. Paragraph 4, giving and withholding. Quote, she wanted to be completely hers. She wanted him to be completely hers, and she to be completely his. But it often seemed to her that the more she tried to give him everything, the more she denied him something. The very thing that a light and superficial love or flirtation gives to a person. It worried her that she was not able to combine seriousness with lightheartedness. So here's the problem. She cannot wholeheartedly give an incomplete love. She wishes to love him the way that he wants to be loved, or at least that parts of him have been loved and desire to be loved, but she can't provide him with both kinds of love in the same way at the same time. She can't do it. She either has to love him with that kind of pure wholeheartedness or in a light way that she's incapable of doing anyway, but she can't get both at the same time. It's impossible. Paragraph 5, being together. Quote, in solitude, it was possible for her to get the greatest enjoyment from the presence of the man she loved. If his presence had been continuous, it would have kept on disappearing. Only when alone was she able to hold on to it. Do you understand why I'm contextualizing this in terms of paradoxes? I mean, Kundera does just, I think, a fantastic job of showing the problem on one side, the problem on the other, and the uninhabitable gap in between the two, and just laying it right out in a way that's difficult to avoid thinking of one's own life in relation to that. So the problem in this case is that she has an idealized grasp of who he is, that his actual presence, his tendency to humiliate her, to trigger her insecurities, tends to interrupt, obviously, right? When she's alone, she can be in the relationship with the young man that disappears as soon as they're together. She wants to be in the relationship, and it requires him actually being there, but the relationship that she wants to have is never there when he's there. It's a problem. Paragraph 6, the game begins. Quote, at last she caught sight of it. She stopped and began to wave at it, the car that the young man's driving. She stopped and began to wave at it like the hitchhiker waving at a stranger's car. The sports car slowed down and stopped close to the girl. The young man leaned toward his window, rolled it down, smiled, and asked, where are you headed, miss? Here, the perception that her wave is like one that would attract a stranger's interest becomes a reality in which the young man and the girl disconnect from their normal ways of interacting with each other. Right? It's a metaphor that they both understand. She intends to wave like a stranger, and he understands that it's that like is meant to be there in that very same way. And what that does is liberate them into a new kind of space in the relationship. And again, go back to what we talked about all the way back from the sister, right? The notion of a game, the sense of like, creates a new kind of space that they can inhabit as new kinds of characters. It's a space for their relationship that hadn't been opened before because they hadn't been strangers in that way. Now, all of a sudden, that opportunity emerges. They're in a space that frees them from what had previously been the boundaries in their relationship. Okay? But it's all predicated in terms of a hypothetical. So the space emerges through the power of like. She's behaving like something. And that likeness is what appears to be the case. And as is true with every appearance, the appearance both reveals something and there's a truth to that appearance, right? But the way that what appears is true simultaneously conceals something else that's true. That's the logic of something being like something else. Anything that's like something both is and is not like that thing. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to read it. What is she behaving like?
She's behaving like a hitchhiker who's flagging down a ride from a young man. And they talked before about how, when he's on his trips, he probably always picks up the pretty girls and whatever. And that's her jealousy talking. And he was kind of a player back in the day, so that's not too far from the truth. And so she waves to him like a hitchhiker, and it enters them into this appearance where she's like the hitchhiker without being one, which both reveals something new about her potential as a character, but it conceals a lot of who she is. Does that structure of like make sense? Okay. Part 3, paragraph 9. You look like you enjoy lying to women, said the girl, and into her words there crept unawares a touch of the old anxiety, because she really did believe that her young man enjoyed lying to women. The girl's jealousy often irritated the young man, but this time he could easily overlook it, for after all, her words didn't apply to him, but to the unknown driver. And so he just casually inquired, does it bother you? Okay, and going back, the girl is like a hitchhiker. The young man is like a stranger in the same kind of way, right? And has that same kind of dynamic of revealing something new, but concealing other things. They're both two different people in terms of what's going on in the car simultaneously, but they flip back and forth. They're not the same way at the same time. They're one or the other, and they start to switch back and forth. Does that make sense? Okay. The above paragraph that I just read shows how the conversation is multiplied. And again, she speaks from two perspectives, and he listens from two perspectives. Both that which is revealed and that which is concealed. Both of those are ongoing within them at both times. Her statement pushes her anxiety about her young man into things, even though the tone of the banter is directed at an anonymous driver. The young man receives it from the other direction. He can attribute the anxiety is directed to the driver, but not to him. Does that make sense? All right. The next paragraph also continues in this vein. Quote, if I were going with you, then it would bother me, said the girl, and her words contained a subtle, instructive message for the young man, but the end of her sentence applied only to the unknown driver. But I don't know you, so it doesn't bother me. Kundera here shows how communication can work with couples. In the first case, a statement becomes barbed in spite of the girl's wishes, and in the second, she created a sentence that provided the content for each member of the audience, the young man, and also the driver. We okay? All right. The final paragraph of chapter 3 gets the paradox of desire. And again, I'll read, quote, and what if I get out with you? At those words, the girl looked up at him and found that he looked exactly as she imagined him in her most agonizing hours of jealousy. She was alarmed at how he was flattering her and flirting with her, an unknown hitchhiker, and how becoming it was to him. Therefore, she responded with a defiant provocativeness. What would you do with me, I wonder? What Kundera does here is acknowledge that part of the problem driving this is the girl's jealousy. Right? She knows it's a problem. He knows it's a problem. And Kundera's very aware that that's the problem. He is, as her fears have fantasized. And she's alarmed that it becomes him. She doesn't like that she's attracted to what she's always feared about him. It looks good on him. Quote, I wouldn't have to think too hard about what to do with such a beautiful woman, said the young man gallantly. And at this moment, he was once again speaking far more to his own girl than to the figure of the hitchhiker, right? So he shifts internally in order to make that statement. It's notable as it shows that the young man cannot divorce the girl from her character. He can speak far more to his own girl than to the figure, but both are present at this time. It doesn't have the distinction of earlier, right? They're starting to blur a little bit. Quote, but this flattering sentence made the girl feel as if she had caught him at something. She felt toward him a brief flash of intense hatred and said, aren't you rather too sure of yourself? The young man looked at the girl. Her defiant face appeared to him to be completely convulsed. He felt sorry for her and longed for her usual familiar expression, which he used to call childish and simple. He leaned toward her and softly spoke the name with which he usually addressed her and with which he now wanted to stop the game. But the girl released herself and said, you're going a bit too fast. So what the young man desires is exactly the expression that he also finds childish. And again, you have that kind of ambivalence or the paradox of desire, right? You both want and don't want what is there and what is not there. And you always both want and don't want what you have and what you don't, in different ways at different times. It would be familiar. He wants what's familiar and comforting, though, which is part of why he likes her purity and childishness and simplicity and innocence and all those kinds of things. It's comforting to him. It's familiar. It's become familiar. This point in the story also marks the first point where the game could have been brought to an end, right? And there's a whole bunch of times where the game could have been brought to an end, but they both keep it going in spite of themselves. In this case, the girl, jealous and angry, pushes the game forward. We okay so far? Okay. At this point also, the game has confirmed the girl's worst fears to her by revealing how her young man behaves with strangers, although she's not really a stranger. But she both hates and desires that. It shows the young man why he values the girl, precisely by seeing her as the kind of woman that he dated previously, only in its absence. Neither of them seem particularly happy with this game at this part of the story. Right? But they're both trapped in it. They don't know how to bring it to an end together. Because they started it together, neither one of them has the power to stop it independently. Okay? Chapter 4. The girl doesn't want to admit that she repulsed the young man out of jealousy, right? Because that'd be owning too much truth in some ways, and that would ruin the game. And so she reconstructs her motive as one that desired that the game begin. She apologizes, and the young man replies, excuse me, I won't touch you again, said the young man. I'm quoting again. He was furious with the girl for not listening to him and refusing to be herself when that was what he wanted. And since the girl insisted on continuing in her role, he transferred his anger to the unknown hitchhiker. And all at once, he discovered the character of his own part. He began to play the tough guy who treats women to the coarser aspects of his masculinity: willfulness, sarcasm, self-assurance. So her anger emerges as she refuses to submit, although he directs it at her role. This introduces his character. And again, he's playing a part. He's a character, the tough guy. Kundera continues. The role was a complete contradiction of the young man's habitually solicitous approach to the girl. He had never resembled a heartless tough guy because he had never demonstrated either a particularly strong will or ruthlessness. However, if he did not resemble such a man, nonetheless, he had longed to at one time. Of course, it was quite a naive desire, but there it was. Childish desires withstand all the snares of the adult mind and often survive into ripe old age. And this childish desire quickly took advantage of the opportunity to embody itself in the proffered role. Right? I mean, Kundera is just brilliant there. You know, you have all these thoughts of who the kind of person. I mean, as you're a kid, you see all these kinds of characters, all these different kinds of people modeled. And they're modeled both in terms of the adult relationships that you see experienced, but more than that, they're modeled in the kinds of stories that you watch, the stories that you read. And the stock characters that populate most of the entertainment programming are horrible. They're absolutely horrible. They're flat and they're two-dimensional. But when you're a kid, you don't know that. You see that the tough guy gets a certain kind of respect, and you want to be that tough guy. And even though you talk yourself out of it, you're like, I don't really want to be that guy. That childish desire is there, And from Kundera's perspective, it can seize a moment to come into being and allow you to play out what you've always wanted to be, or at least a little part of you has always wanted to be. You have a moment or an opportunity to kind of let that out. Does that make sense? So, in this passage, then, Kundera is once again asking a question of identity, right? And he exposes the fluid nature of our identities beneath the surface. The young man isn't shown to be aware of what's occurring, right? This is all the narrator. This is all Kundera interpreting what's happening. The young man has no idea that that's what's happening. He instead uses the game as a way to become the kind of person he once desired to be, even though he's no longer conscious of that desire. It's a dead desire relative to him, but it's an active one that's nonetheless in control.
Is it a dead desire? Or is
he no longer, he
doesn't
wake up in the morning and be like, I'm going to be a tough guy, right? That's something that he wanted to be when he was 7. You know, if I don't know, I grew up watching the A-Team. I always kind of wanted to be all of the A-Team, like at different times in different ways. I don't really want to be any of those guys now, but I kind of did. You know, and if the opportunity arose, would I be? I don't know. You know, I think it's more like that. But would I notice that I'm really, being B.A. Baracus in a very kind of awkward way? Probably not. Like that desire would just take over and I'd be that tough guy that I never knew I could be. But just for a moment, right? You'd just have that opportunity to manifest because it's an early wish. So the consequence of the young man's becoming the tough guy character is to help more clearly define the girl's role for her, right? So the young man's character comes into focus in response to the girl's jealousy, which is directed both at the young man and at the hitchhiker, but in appropriating it as the hitchhiker, he understands who the hitchhiker can be. Once the driver is more clearly defined, the girl understands her role in response to him. It's a dialectical movement, right? Once there's a thesis and antithesis, and then there's a movement dialectically that doesn't negate it, but it just makes something new come into being out of the convergence of those two. So, here's Kundera, quote, "The young man's sarcastic reserve suited the girl very well. It freed her from herself, the epitome of jealousy. She doesn't want to be jealous. The moment she saw only his inaccessible face, her jealousy subsided. The girl could forget herself and give herself up to her role. Her role? What was her role? It was a role out of trashy literature, an artful seductress. The girl slipped into this silly romantic part with an ease that astonished her and held her spellbound. Something magic about knowing what those really stock roles are and being able to just slide into them. Because it's stock, you don't have to think about it because the script's already been written for you. You're just performing it. So because the jealousy only relates to the young man, the tough guy frees her from her jealousy and therefore from the anxieties that generally create her, right? Most of the time, she's nothing but her anxieties as they manifest. Because the young man has changed, she has nothing to be anxious about. Her anxieties are quelled, and she's free to become the artful seductress all of a sudden. And it's liberating. And it spellbinds her. And it's a transition that emerges through forgetting herself. She doesn't remember who she is because she doesn't have those anxieties, which have defined who she is. And in letting those anxieties go, she forgets who she herself is and is able to become something new. Is this process making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Identity is super flexible, and that's a lot of what Kundera is trying to do is outline both how identities are flexible and the way that narratives help to construct both characters that we know to slide into very, very quickly without thinking, and how narratives allow us to want to do that in relation to the narratives that we create with one another. Okay? So at this point in the story, the girl and her young man have severed themselves from their normal identities, and therefore also from their pattern in the relationship. They're no longer themselves, either to themselves or to each other. The young man takes shelter in the space created by an early ideal self, and the girl becomes the anonymous figure of anonymous literature. Right? So there are two different kind of versions of self that they can inhabit. One's an early wish and one's just kind of a stock role. But they're both able to inhabit those unthinkingly with a lot of forgetting.
Doesn't it seem like the tough guy early childhood desire is many stock characters?
Probably. Or it's somebody he knew or whatever. I mean, but yeah, it's mostly probably a stock character also. Chapter 5. Here, Kundera describes the young man as occupying the paradoxical space between needing to plan and hating the burden of planning. I'm assuming this is a fairly familiar space that most of us often find ourselves inhabiting. Liberated by the game, though, he detours from their planned destination. Here's Kundera, quote, "Don't be afraid, I'll take care of you," said the young man. So they drove and chatted thus, the driver and the hitchhiker, who did not know each other, which is both false, but also kind of true at this point. Right? They don't know themselves. They definitely don't know each other at this point in the story. Quote, "The game all at once went into a higher gear." And if you reread this at any point, a lot of it, like you're going too fast, the game going into a higher gear, like there's a ton of just travel metaphors that Kundera just sprinkles all the way through. It's a little bit delicious, kind of delightful once you pick up on it. But here the game goes into a higher gear. Fiction was suddenly making an assault upon real life. The young man was moving away from himself and from the implacable straight road from which he had never strayed until now. Kundera's played with metaphors throughout. And again, the higher gear, the figurative road of life now becomes the real road that he's driving. It's consistent throughout the story. And again, moving back to the like, that's part of what he's trying to show is the way that those kinds of metaphorical or simile statements do a lot of work for us, right? And allowing us to shift from one register to another unthinkingly. The claim that, quote, fiction is suddenly making an assault on real life is also a bit late, because remember that the girl had long been assaulted by fictions created by her jealousies, right? He had never betrayed her. There's no indication that he'd ever been unfaithful to her. That was just her jealousy creating fictions that in turn assaulted real life and altered the nature of their relationship. Fiction always assaults real life because reality is merely one fiction that we cling to above others. It's all interpretation. There's no true story. They're all fictions that we fabricate and make up, and we're always a character that we inhabit for now because that's what's most convenient to us. And this is part of where the story gets really, really scary. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I've had a question. What is it exactly about the nature of purity that eliminates somebody's capacity to be pure when they sort of enter this realm of sexual liberation?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, sorry. So what exactly is it about purity that makes it so you cannot simultaneously be pure and have this more lascivious trait? I probably should have asked that after chapter 1.
Yeah. I think it's hard to answer that in abstraction. Mm-hmm. I think for the girl, it's because she feels so much her body that the young man interprets it as purity, but she doesn't, right? For her, her body needs to be protected and kept safe, which is a different thing from purity entirely, right? She's not trying to be pure in a very like legalistic or like hyper religious sense. Like she just wants to be protected and not be vulnerable and not expose something that feels very raw to her. And so as long as she has those anxieties in control, she can't be lascivious in any way. Mm-hmm. As soon as those anxieties diminish, she's able to not worry about it as much anymore. And so she's liberated from those worries and thus can enter into a different kind of relationship with her body than she'd had before. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Chapter 6. The paradox of desire. What he wanted isn't what he wants. Quote, out of the car, he was, of course, himself again. And it was upsetting for him to find himself in the evening somewhere completely different from his intended destination. The more so because no one had forced him to do it. And as a matter of fact, he hadn't even really wanted to. He blamed himself for the piece of folly, but then became reconciled to it. So that's the young man. The situation of the girl is this. Quote, the girl also threw off her role. She was so devoted to the young man that she confidently entrusted every moment of her life to him. On the other hand, the idea once again popped into her mind that perhaps other women had waited for her man in his car. But surprisingly enough, this idea didn't upset her at all now. And again, that's a huge indication that her character has changed, right? She's not the young girl that started the trip. She is somebody different because that's not an idea that her anxieties as the character that she had been would ever let lie. Does that make sense? She's changed. Even when she throws off her role, who she is very much in flux at this point.
The road is like a passage of time, in that sense.
Yeah, and you can watch as the journey progresses how their characters just continue to evolve. They're very temporary. Continuing. In fact, she smiled at the thought of how nice it was that today she was this other woman, this irresponsible, indecent other woman, one of those women of whom she was so jealous. It seemed to her that she was cutting them all out, that she had learned how to use their weapons, how to give the young man what until now she had not known how to give him: lightheartedness, shamelessness, and dissoluteness. A curious feeling of satisfaction filled her because she alone had the ability to be all women, and in this way she alone could completely captivate her lover and hold his interest. So if before it was kind of creepy that the young man was upset at the girl for not obeying her and ending the game, the girl here is equally controlling and creepy in this moment, right? She wants absolute control over who the young man is. She's interpreting her situation in terms of power. So by playing the part of one who triggered her anxieties, she feels more powerful because she's the kind of person who she used to be afraid of. Does that make sense? She also realizes that she can now supply all of the man's needs. She is the sole holder of his interest. She fears no rival. Nothing can touch her. She's unassailable. Chapter 7. So they're in the hotel bar, and the girl orders a vodka and challenges the young man about his plans to take care of her. So that's the scene. This is Kundera again. Something was beginning to irritate him about the girl's game. And now it's the girl's game, not just the game that they're both co-creating, right? It's just the girl's game. Now, he realized it wasn't just the words which were turning her into a stranger, but that her whole persona had changed. The movement of her body and her facial expression, and that she unpalatably and faithfully resembled that type of woman whom he knew so well and for whom he felt some aversion. And again, what he feels aversion toward and what he desires is shifting for him too, as he becomes more aware of what's now absent in the girl or what's concealed relative to what's revealing itself. He misses it. And in missing what he had once had and didn't always like, he now also knows that what he once had, he doesn't like at all. That kind of dissoluteness, right? So he's having some relatively self-aware moments throughout this section. The paradoxes of identity and desire once more assert themselves through that paragraph, though. The girl's language alters her physical self-presentation, right? So it starts out with just her kind of reciting the script or the words that the artful seductress should use, but is changing how she positions and holds her body. She's truly becoming the kind of woman that he both desires and despises. Quote, "It irritated the young man more and more how well able the girl was to become the lascivious miss. It meant that she was really like that." And again, those kinds of reallys are super loaded terms, right? And what he wants to do is to define what she really is with the capital R in some unalterable core, and now he's got her, right? Oh, she's really like that. The way that she realized, oh, he's really that kind of flirtatious person. He's really the tough guy. And throughout this story, they're both trying to identify who the other really is, at the same time as they're performing roles that they're really not, but also can be. And nothing stops them from being that. And that's part of what both of them are starting to realize about each other. They're not really anything at all.
And not only that, but the roles they choose to play are changing who the other one is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if we're saying that he simultaneously desires and despises these more sexually liberated, lascivious types of women, then what was his attitude initially towards the girl as he knew her in her original form?
He both desired and belittled her, right? Mm-hmm. So he thought that she was too, he'd make fun of her for being too prudish or too shy or whatever. He'd make fun of her, but he also liked that about her. He kind of resented it and also kind of desired it. Mm-hmm. Is what made her different from everybody else that he'd been with, but it was a difference that he both admired and despised. Again, that's the paradox of desire. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Continuing with Kundera. After all, no alien soul had entered into her from somewhere in space. What she was acting now was she herself. Perhaps it was the part of her being which had formerly been locked up. No, opposite him was not sitting a strange woman in his girl's body. It was his girl, herself, and no one else. He looked at her and felt growing aversion toward her. However, it was not only aversion. The more the girl withdrew from him psychically, the more he longed for her physically. The alien quality of her soul drew attention to her body. It turned her body into a body for him, as if until now it had existed for the young man hidden within clouds of compassion, tenderness, concern, love, and emotion. It seemed to the young man that today he was seeing his girl's body for the first time. And again, realize that the movement between revealing and concealing is very much apparent there, right? The qualities of love, comfort, tenderness, and all of those things concealed the girl's body as just a sexually lascivious being. She couldn't see that kind of body because what was revealed were all these other kinds of qualities that he drew out as the kind of thing he wanted then. Now that those things are gone, what it reveals is that she does have the kind of body that he just wants sexually, but it conceals all the other qualities that he previously desired. That's the dialectic or the dynamic or the paradox between revealing and concealing. Do you see how that's working out? Okay. So from the girl's perspective, she had long seen her body as important, and it therefore became a source of anxiety to be protected with modesty and a sense of shame. The game freed her from this, allowing her to offer her body differently. The young man is confused by the girl's identity because her language affects her physical presentation. He feels that it's truly her, as though what she had been before, which both attracted and repelled him according to the logic of ambivalence at the heart of desire. Right?
Of course, this is not maybe super relevant, but what he thought he liked was actually her anxieties, which I think most people would rather disclaim their anxieties than embrace them.
But he didn't see them as anxieties. He just saw the purity, right? He knew that she was jealous and he knew that he was modest, but he didn't really penetrate to you have a lot of anxieties about your body, and that manifests in different ways at different times, right? And so he couldn't see the anxiety behind it. He just saw the expressions of those, one of which he admired, which was the modesty, and the other one which he disliked, which was the jealousy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. All right. Chapter 8. After having offered the young man's interpretation, Kundera switches to narrate the young woman's self-understanding. It features less ambivalence and represents instead an overcoming of her youthful identifications, instead of the embrace of them, which is features in the young man, right? So whereas the young man looks back to an earlier ideal self and wants to be that, what the young woman's able to do is release herself from the fears that she'd had as a younger girl. So it's kind of an opposite dynamic that's working between them. Quote, she, who was always nervous or anxious, felt completely relaxed. The alien life was a life without shame, without biographical specifications, without past or future, without obligations. It was a life that was extraordinarily free. The girl, as a hitchhiker, could do anything. Everything was permitted to her. So the first thing that happens is that the role provides a relief from the anxieties that have beset her. That's pretty clear, right? Moving on. Quote, she was aware that the people were watching her from all the tables. It was a new sensation, one she didn't recognize. Indecent joy caused by her body. Until now, she had never been able to get rid of the 14-year-old girl within herself who was ashamed of her breasts and had the disagreeable feeling that she was indecent. Even though she was proud of being pretty, this feeling of pride was always immediately curtailed by shame. She longed for her body to relate only to the man she loved. When men stared at her breasts in the street, it seemed to her that they were invading a piece of her most secret privacy, which should belong only to herself and to her lover. But now she was the hitchhiker, the woman without a destiny. In this role, she was relieved of the tender bonds of her love and began to be intensely aware of her body. And her body became more aroused the more alien the eyes watching it. So if the first thing is a relief from anxiety, the second thing that Kundera points out is that the girl feels the power that arises from becoming desirable. About sharing publicly that which love had suggested that she keep only for private and intimate moments. Her body becomes more truly hers as she no longer feels a need to sequester it for one person only. And the power of that role arouses her. Does that make sense?
So is it possible that what the man cherishes so much about her purity is that it enables her to be intimate? And
Wholly
love can be
his. Yeah, he loves it.
rather
Yeah.
than transactional?
Yeah, but I mean, he really likes being wholly hers.
Mhm.
And he really likes that kind of devoted love, but he also kind of likes the lighthearted, flirtatious, shameless behavior too, right? He likes both things. In this relationship, what appeals most about the girl is that kind of wholehearted devotion. But it also irritates him sometimes, but not always, right? Because the young man isn't just a character in a story who's fictionalized and whatnot, but any young man in that situation isn't just this one person, right? There's a whole bunch of little identities and little motives and little desires that are all in competition with each other. There is no really. The really is something that we narrate to ourselves out of convenience, and that's it. I will continue. Chapter 9. The game exposes the tension at the heart of the relationship. Quote, the young man did not for a moment stop seeing his girl in the hitchhiker, and it was precisely this that was tormenting. He saw his girl seducing a strange man and had the bitter privilege of being present, of seeing at close quarters how she looked and of hearing what she said when she was cheating on him. When she had cheated on him, when she would cheat on him, right? And he's already fictionalizing all of this. Quote, he had the paradoxical honor of being himself the pretext of her unfaithfulness, end quote. So because he can no longer see her as his girl, he no longer can understand himself as the object of her affection because she's relating to him in a completely different way. Because it's a very different kind of relationship, he can't see it as being a version of fidelity. It has to be cheating because that's not how they are together. Continuing, quote, this was all the worse because he worshipped rather than loved her. It had always seemed to him that her inward nature was real only within the bounds of fidelity and purity, and beyond those bounds, it simply didn't exist. Beyond these bounds, she would cease to be herself, as water ceases to be water beyond the boiling point. When he now saw her crossing this horrifying boundary with nonchalant elegance, he was filled with anger. So, Kundera once again returns to the problem of essentializing one's partner within a relationship, even if well-intended. By knowing her only in one way, he feels any change as a betrayal, a very personal betrayal, a very intimate betrayal. Zach?
So in the context of their relationship, what exactly is the distinction between worship and love?
To worship is to worship one. I mean, it's a one-sided veneration. He worships this about her, and that freezes her on the pedestal, such that if she's not that thing that's worshipped, she's not who she is. There's no dynamic interchange. There's no possibility of the kind of change that love might suggest, because love is neither this nor that, right? It's a fluid, ongoing, emerging element, rather than a worship, which is one directional. I worship you in this way and in this way only.
This is reminding me of the guy at the end of the symposium who simultaneously worships Socrates, but also sexualizes him.
Mm-hmm. Because he wants to own him in the way that he can own him, the way that he knows how, and he lacks the capacity to be more than that. Mm-hmm. So it's a one-directional worship that doesn't have that kind of dynamic engagement that love would require. Yeah. All right. So finally, Kundera talks specifically about the paradox of the game, its paradoxical quality of liberating and imprisoning those who play. And although this game is more intentional, the implication is that each of our relationships, and particularly our intimate ones, are games that liberate and imprison simultaneously. Every relationship is a game. Every relationship has its own rules. Every relationship will imprison you. Every relationship, or imprison you from doing some things, and it will liberate you to do other certain things. But it's all a game. and it has its rules. And if you break those rules, everything falls apart. Here's what Kundera says, quote, even in a game, there lurks a lack of freedom. Even a game is a trap for the players. If they had really been two strangers, the hitchhiker could long ago have taken offense and left. But there's no escape from a game. A team cannot flee the playing field. The boundaries of the playing field are fixed. The girl knew that she had to accept whatever form the game might take just because it was a game. She knew that the more extreme the game became, the more it would be a game and the more obediently she would have to play it. And it was futile to warn her dazed soul that she must keep her distance from the game. Just because it was only a game, her soul was not afraid, did not oppose the game, and narcotically sank deeper into it. So the girl's interpretation of the game still embraces the bad faith of earlier. It's simultaneously important and unimportant to her, right? She can't leave it because parts of her know it's only a game, and the parts of her that think, oh, we're only playing a game, override all the absolute terror that's starting to grip her at this time. Chapter 10. The couple retreats to the bedroom in the hotel. Quote, he tried to discover behind her lascivious expression the familiar features which he loved tenderly. It was as if you were looking at two images through the same lens, two images superimposed one upon the other, with the one showing through the other. These two images showing through each other were telling him that everything was in the girl, that her soul was terrifyingly amorphous, that it held faithfulness and unfaithfulness, treachery and innocence, flirtatiousness and chastity. And again, ironically, this is the whole thing that the girl wanted to be, right? To her, this means, oh, I can please you in all the ways. For him, he's saying, oh, what you'd revealed to me before is false. You're all the things. You're not just one thing. You're not worshipable. You're everything that I both love and hate at different times and in different ways. You have no integrity in your character. You're too fluid. So she wanted to be the paradoxical unity of all things, and he feels that paradoxical unity is impossible and therefore false. Does that make sense? Okay. This disorderly jumble seemed disgusting to him, like the variety to be found in a pile of garbage. Both images continued to show through each other, and the young man understood that the girl differed only on the surface from other women. But deep down, she was the same as they, full of all possible thoughts, feelings, and vices, which justified all the secret misgivings and fits of jealousy. The impression that certain outlines delineated her as an individual was only a delusion to which the other person, the one who is looking, was subject, namely himself. It seemed to him that the girl he loved was a creation of his desire, his thoughts, and his faith, and that the real girl now standing in front of him was hopelessly alien, hopelessly ambiguous. He hated her.
He had been so ruthlessly sexist the entire time in his creation of this woman, in this image of this woman.
It's sexist in some ways, but in a way it was also a release from the kind of predatory sexualization of women that he'd had before, right? His ability to admire and worship her purity is a different kind of sexism, right? It's a different way of relating to her sexually than the kind of young man that he had been in the past.
And just both are incapable of seeing her as a whole human.
She's not, right? And that's his problem. She's not a one whole human, right? She's no one thing. And that's what's disgusting to him. That's what he hates. But he can't understand that paradoxical unity, right? All he can see is, oh, in the past she'd revealed this kind of pure self. What she was concealing is that she's just like everybody else. I thought she was really different, but really she's just the same. What he can't grasp is that there's no really, right? If he would be able to understand that, he would win the game. There is no really. But he can't do that. And things are starting to break.
So it's her exact ability to be everything that makes her nothing to him.
Yeah. So what the young man sees is the fluidity of identity, although he doesn't see himself as similarly constructed, right? He hates it in her. He doesn't see that he himself is doing the same thing. His need to have a pure girl and the girl's ability to become an impersonal self leaves him unable to recall her distinctive individuality. So, okay, I'll return to Kundera. Quote, the game merged with life. The game of humiliating the hitchhiker became only a pretext for humiliating his girl. The young man had forgotten that he was playing a game. He simply hated the woman standing in front of him. So the young man needs to reassert his power over the relationship, and the only tool that he has at hand is shame and humiliation, the kinds of tools that the tough guy would have, the kinds of tools that he's also always been capable of, and he's just never used, especially not in this relationship. He cannot see his own fears that drive the need for power, and he can't see that his anxieties are very similar to the anxieties that he had both loved and despised about her, right? He's not self-reflective enough. Only the narrator can see that. The young man himself does not. Chapter 11. The girl is able to strip in a new way, absent shyness, and believes that her nakedness will end the game. But the young man has stopped noticing what was familiar and peculiar to the girl and sees her only as the abstract, alien kind of woman that she had always tried to become but never was. He wants her to quote, be like a whore. But the young man had never had a whore, and the ideas that he had about them came from literature and hearsay. So he turns to these ideas, and he commands her to dance on a table. This inflamed his imperiousness. He denies her attempts to exit the game, and so she performs for him. Right? It goes back to the stories we tell. Hearsay is a story. Literature is a story. It's all this kind of trashy story. Well, what's a whore? I don't know. Be like a whore, because that's how I want to humiliate you. What's that mean? I'll just make something up. Neither of us really actually know, so we'll just keep acting as though we do and keep making believe. The description of sex, within that description that Kundera offers, the imbalance of power is restored. Quote, he had intercourse with her. The event is one that triggers the girl's fears of, quote, lovemaking without emotion or love. She knew that she had crossed the forbidden boundary, but she proceeded across it without objections and as a full participant. Only somewhere did she feel horror at the thought that she had never known such pleasure, never so much pleasure as at this moment, beyond the boundary, end quote. The girl feels a paradoxical blend of horror and pleasure, two emotions that arise when enjoying the forbidden that thus spur it forward. Chapter 12. Kundera shows the ultimate consequences of the game, including the young man's refusal to release her from the game. She has lost her sense of self because her self was not recognized by her intimate partner when she was at her most vulnerable. Quote, then it was all over. He knew that the game was over, but didn't feel like returning to their customary relationship. He feared this return. After a moment, he heard her sobbing quietly. The girl's hand diffidently, childishly touched his. It touched, withdrew, then touched again, and then a pleading, sobbing voice broke the silence, calling him by his name and saying, I am me, I am me. The young man was silent. He didn't move, and he was aware of the sad emptiness of the girl's assertion, in which the unknown was defined in terms of the same unknown quantity. And the girl soon passed from sobbing to loud crying and went on endlessly repeating this pitiful tautology, I am me, I am me, I am me. The young man began to call compassion to his aid, so as to be able to calm the girl. There was still 13 days vacation before them. So the young man, power restored, returns to his practical mindset. He recognizes that neither I nor me have concrete meaning for the girl, but he doesn't realize and acknowledge that this is just as true for him as well. Here are the implications. Number one, Kundera, like Gateskill, discusses the ambivalence of desire and how this ambivalence rests under the fears and anxieties that we're too slow to acknowledge and too tentative to explore. This ambivalence causes us to dislike both our partner and alternatives to our partner. As lovers, humans seem impossible to satisfy. Number two, Kundera also discusses the relationship between language, games in this case, and bodies. The way that the roles we play shape how our bodies interact. Altering language in a relationship is simultaneously liberating and horrifying because by redefining the relationship, it also redefines the identities of those in the relationship, right? You can't change a relationship without changing and altering substantially the identities of those who that relationship would belong to, right? That makes sense? These are positively correlated. The game shapes the identity which fuels the game, right? The longer the game goes on, the more the identities change in response to that, which drives the game even further, et cetera, et cetera. Number three, identity is difficult. Who we are is largely who we habitually present ourselves as being, but nothing prevents us from doing otherwise. To fix, as the young man does, on one quality threatens the integrity of the relationship by denying the possibility of change. Number 4. All relationships are also exchanges of power and control that are constantly being negotiated and worked through. The more intentionally these boundaries and balances are negotiated, the better off both partners are. It becomes most problematic when the relationship, the dynamics of power are driven by each person's hidden anxieties and fears that never come to the surface as such and therefore are unable to be intentionally quelled by a loving partner. Number 5. As a final thought, Kundera's story suggests that we remain lonely within relationships, in part because our identities are always changing. Our identities in our relationships never stop being a provisional fiction. We cannot be known or determined in an absolute way because we're not absolute beings. We're constantly within a flux of becoming. Those parts of ourselves repressed in shame need to be welcomed into relationships in healthy and meaningful ways in order for the relationship to become something that we truly and authentically can enjoy. One senses that although this relationship fell apart in a spectacular way, that it wasn't maybe the healthiest relationship to begin with. Both played parts the whole time, and thus both of them were always alone. Any final questions?
So what happens after 13 days? Are you gonna write a second?
I don't think he ever wrote a sequel to the story. I mean, one senses that it would be a very difficult 13 days to be together with just the two of you. I mean, they cross lines that are really going to be hard to come back from.
Right.
Or they just go back to replaying their same roles as though nothing ever happened. I don't know that they can do that, though.
It feels like that girl would want to be moving on after a liberating experience like that.
Probably.
See, I felt sorry in the beginning. I felt sorry for her, but after I kept reading that last page, I finally decided no. I think of the two, if one's to be pitied, it's him. But
Then again, like the trying to humiliate her, depending on how effective that is, which like with both of them not really knowing how a whore behaves or how a whore should feel, like that maybe it's not that effective, but I don't know.
So it's not just that this transformed version of her melds with his previous perception of her, it's that it exposes his previous perception of her to have been illusory.
Only for him, though, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's the problem of appearance. It's the problem of like, or being like this kind of person, or being like that kind of person. And as soon as a relationship is predicated on a like or on appearance, and you're not self-aware that appearances are both true and untrue, right? Not that there's a lie involved, but what appears isn't ever the whole truth. It's just what appears. And that appearance has truth, but that doesn't mean there aren't other contrary truths that are also simply not appearing at this present moment. That's what the young man never understands. That's what the girl doesn't understand. And that's what I think very few people in relationships ever understand about themselves or about their partner. It's not like they're lying. It's not that they're cheating. It's just that what appears, even if it habitually appears, even if that's what you want to have appear all the time, it's still only an appearance. It's still a fiction. It's still a character that you play, and it becomes a comfortable world to inhabit. It's still a character. There is no really.
And so regardless of what the relationship is, it's always perpetually less than complete.
Because the only complete relationship that can exist is with the dead. And even then, that's an incomplete relationship because you yourself change relative to the one who has died. They don't change, right? You change.
And of course, there's all the regrets for a relationship that was left incomplete, and then they died, and there were so many things unsaid.
Yeah.
The comment there about, where it addresses the horror and her discovery that she had more pleasure at that moment than any. But then after that, she still comes back and seems to really crave the need for love.
It's not even a need for love. I mean, she tries to touch and then doesn't, and then tries and then doesn't, because she doesn't know who he is anymore. But she's really trying to get a handle on her own identity, and all she can say is "I am me," and the young man knows that she doesn't know what that even means anymore. And that's what's horrifying about those kind of incredibly potent, transcendent moments of absolute liberation, where you really successfully leave yourself behind. It's glorious. And it's agonizing because you don't know what you come back to. There's no back and there's no forward anymore. Everything that you thought about yourself has been left behind, but there's no pieces to even pick up. And you want to kind of go back and you can't. And that's what gives it so much pleasure. It's why it's so transportive. It's why it's so powerful. But it's a liminal stage. In this case, it's a boundary that she shouldn't have crossed. She didn't have the wherewithal to be able to deal with what it would mean to cross that boundary and still be herself. And that's why it's so psychically damaging to her.
Shouldn't have crossed that line. Like that, yeah, that's suspicious to me. Like, don't you got it?
You don't have to, right? I mean, that's a boundary that seemed to be set up for her own self-preservation, in order for her to remain a self that she would be able to know and understand. And she lost that. That's why all she can say is just "I am me" over and over and over again.
But
without.
Doesn't it seem like that's at the point at her life that she can maybe start critically engaging with her identity?
Maybe she can, right? Maybe that's a possibility. But the other possibility is that she's just broken after that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just she will never be able to regain any sense of being anything other than a transient fiction.
And that's day one. It's the first night.
Yeah.
Right.
But she has her whole life ahead of her, and if she never can be more than just a transient fiction, even to herself, it's horrifying. That's unlearning our loneliness.